Greetings, friends. This week, Rasmussen brings his ethics primer to a close, or in other words, he closes out his task of building the concept of the way an environmental ethic could be derived from an earth-honoring faith. And in that sense, this chapter begins to show how an earth-honoring faith might motivate us to act, which is the basis for a moral theory. In other words, he says, what is the ethical consequence of a moral relationship between the soil and our soul? And Rasmussen begins an answer by calling our attention to the fact that the soil is a self-exceeding creature. Now he's bringing up a point that he began back in chapter 3, that creation as a whole, and specifically the soil itself, gives more than it receives. So on the one hand, that's a startling reality because there is a finite amount that the soil can give without receiving. But he names that in order to engender a sense of gratitude for the plenitude of life that the soil continues to provide for us. And it's in this way that the soil, says Rasmussen, is self-transcending. That is, it participates in life beyond itself. It is ecstatic in that way. And ecstasy is actually a significant moral motivator. The mystics all realize this, that ecstasy is precisely getting outside of yourself in order to experience life with the other that teaches you something precious about the other life and yourself. And in the case of Christian mystics, the other is the Spirit of God. But Rasmussen suggests that the soil constantly gives life beyond itself. And if we can learn to appreciate or recognize that life comes from beyond us in this way, that would nurture in us the virtues of gratitude that would change our moral response or our relationship to creation that lies beyond our ego or even our species. So he suggests that we have to continue to run Genesis forward instead of in reverse, as Bill McKibben has described, with respect to our current lifestyle of consumption. In other words, to live in a way that augments the conditions for life to grow, not depleting or unraveling Earth's creative potential. And if we're to do that, then we have to live in accordance with the Earth's natural carrying capacity, or the soil's rate of creating and sustaining life. So we have to live according to our proper weight, or consume according to a human footprint. If we take more, as Rasmussen has suggested, we're consuming with the footprint of a blue whale, for instance, we outstrip the soil's rate of replenishing, be that mineral, nutrient, or in raw materials. That's a reminder that the ability of the earth to provide should be a factor in measuring a sustainable rate of our consumption. And on page 205, Rasmussen suggests that this is one of our greatest problems, to rightly shape our human identity and our ethical response. It's that we are a species generally living out of our context. We seem to have uncritically resigned ourselves to the idea that our ethical context should be understood by how much we can produce and consume, not how much can the earth provide for the livelihood of our species, and when. So in terms of ethics, the operative point here is that the limits and the ecological context in which we live should have something to do with the formation of our moral identity and our moral response. As a way to highlight this point, Rasmussen raises a rejoinder to the environmental justice movement. He suggests that the environmental justice movement grew out of the realization that the legacy of colonial oppression has everything to do with the fact that the land itself was colonized and that the land was used as a tool to disenfranchise and oppress people. Slaves, First Nations, and impoverished people are largely pressed into those realities by either a forced relationship to the land or by being displaced from it. And at the heart of the environmental injustice movement is the notion that if we're going to heal our relationship to the land and to one another, then we have to think not only like the mountain, as many environmental philosophers teach us, but we have to think like the people who were displaced from the mountain. But Rasmussen says that while all of this is good and right, there's also more. He looks to the writings of Mary Midgley to remind us that we can not only approach the question from an anthropocentric view, that our view of justice should not only be informed and motivated by the experience of humans that have been oppressed by the colonization of the land, but that the creatures and the land itself are members of that moral community. That's the difference between environmental justice and eco-justice, as Rasmussen conceives of them. And again, this brings back a familiar chord that Rasmussen has struck throughout this text, which we can say now has become his refrain. So this gives us an action point that can move us now from an ethical theory to a new method of doing ethics. And in this new key of an earth-honoring ethical method, we'll take nature as one of our teachers, and ecology or bioregion becomes the context. So this theory that he's building is not a new deontological law about how to live green or a new way to calculate a utilitarian good. Rather, it involves the experience of ecstasy, letting those agents outside of ourselves in our ecological context teach us that justice means demanding no more or no less than our rightful place in this web of belonging. And in this movement from ego to ecosphere, it's an ecstatic method of moral discernment, which happens in communion with the moral agents outside of ourselves, where every other member in the web helps us learn how we should belong, as he says on page 221. This is moral formation, and moral formation has to do with cultivation. Cultivation implies practice. It involves being in a direct, intentional relationship with something else, the land or the other. And the land that we till or keep becomes not just a location for us to do justice, but the lessons that we learn about what it takes to keep the land and to till it in a healthy, life-sustaining way actually informs our understanding of justice. So as Rasmussen works out around page 222, the land which we cultivate, till, and keep becomes the context for our moral formation. And in this way, our culture becomes integrated with our cultivation of the land, not disembodied from it. As an example, I'm recording today's lecture here in Senegal in one of the sacred forests, the Bois Sacré. In generations past, these sacred forests were the location of traditional African religions' rites of initiation, which were coming-of-age rites where youth were enculturated as adults, oftentimes with mystical, animistic practices. These rites of practice and initiation are falling out of use because of the growth of Islam and Christianity, but also because they're associated with male and female circumcision and other abusive rites that are thankfully diminishing in our post-colonial period. But the disavowal of these ancient rites also led to a dissociation from the land. But here in Senegal, they're reclaiming these sacred forests as places of learning and moral formation. Dakar, which is a city of 3.5 million people, was built over top of what used to be a delicate wetland. And this, Han Park, is part of a larger reclamation project. And this sacred forest was reclaimed and reimagined as an ecological formation place of young people coming of age in a post-colonial era. So in light of Rasmussen's definition of eco-justice, this is an example of moral formation in a context where the land, which once was colonialized as the last stop on the West African slave trade, and the people who were once the object of the colonial slave trade, disenfranchised from their land, are now working to liberate and cultivate their cultural identity in the context of the land itself, with a reclaimed or redeemed role for these sacred forests in the formation of a new liberated identity. A new identity as global citizens, but formed in a local ecology where tilling and keeping the health of a delicate wetland ecosystem like the Dakar Peninsula plays a role in the cultivation of their cultural identity as young Africans. This is an example of how a practice can motivate us from the conceptual towards a method of an earth-honoring ethic that realizes how a faithful culture can grow out of practices of cultivating our moral identity in an ecologically embedded context. So with this, Rasmussen says, the conceptual part of his project is now closed. So we're going to now move into the realm of those practices for the rest of the book and the rest of our semester together. So Rasmussen builds this bridge on the foundation of discipleship. He reminds us that discipleship is the way that we learn new ways of becoming, a new kind of community, or an anticipatory community, such as we see here in the reclamation of sacred forests, or in Rasmussen's example of Dag Hammarskjöld, who helped build a community whose practice of anticipating global peace already begins to realize it. The point is that in the doing of these anticipatory practices, we already get ourselves far down the road of cultivating that which we seek. So what are practical ways that we can till, keep, and live with creation that cultivates a church as an anticipatory community that forms us to do the new thing and to live the earth-honoring ethic that embodies justice for all creatures? I know that you all have some wonderful ideas and experiences to contribute to that discussion, and so that's where we're going after the break. Peace.